Do you think there are people who are non-binary, and if so, can you say what they are? Asked for it.
Sounds like respect to me.
It's not
nothing
the same.
More, nothing less.
In the meantime, we shouldn't all mutilate the language to fit around it.
In this video, you are going to see one of the great voices of our time, Douglas Murray, systematically annihilate an SJW, but in the most sophisticated and classy way. During this entire debate, he is anchored to a balanced logic, whilst she goes about committing a tirade of logical fallacies, which at times might be a little bit difficult to catch. So see if you can catch them and leave them in the comments. But either way, I'll point them out. Let's get into the clips.
There are a set of what I describe as tripwire issues, which any journalist, citizen, absolutely anybody, if they just nick one of these tripwires with their foot, can find causes total career implosion. I say that they come down roughly to gay, everything to do with women, particularly relations between the sexes, everything to do with race, and absolutely everything to do with trans. So I decided to do a chapter on each in my latest book to try to say what are the discussions we perhaps ought to be having and the ones that we're not having. Now, I'm very conscious, by the way, that a lot of this, I just throw this out for particularly for English speakers in the audience, or all English speakers, but all people from English-speaking nations, that a lot of these phenomena at the moment seem to me to be particularly prevalent in Britain, America, Canada, Australia. A number of other countries, particularly across Europe, do have bits of it, but including France, but almost nowhere, actually nowhere as virulently as in the countries I've just listed. And that's worth bearing in mind. I think it's a very interesting question as to why it's particularly virulent in these countries. These discussions go on. So what is it that's going on? Well, let me, as it were, do the opposite of straw manning and try to steel man this, because this is something I also happen to agree with. It seems that one of the things we're trying to do is a very noble aspiration, and it's something like this. We're trying to come to a position where somebody with a competency, indeed anybody with a competency in a particular area, is never held back from achieving what they could achieve because of some characteristic. So no young girl growing up anywhere thinks they can't be something because they're a girl. Nobody who's LGBT thinks they can't get anywhere because of their sexuality, and nobody, whatever their skin color, is held back from anywhere because of their skin color.
Guys, if you're enjoying this content and if you want to help me spread this message far and wide, then chuck a thumbs up on the video. Also, leave me a comment. You know how much I love to hear your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. So glad to have you. Back to the clips.
I'm going to treat myself to showing you an example of what I think is going on, which is very unwise in the media, just on this area. Now, let me give you, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I would describe as an overcorrection that's happening in the media on this issue, as I would argue in others as well. One weekend in 2018 on the BBC's website, the front page news website and the BBC, one of the top stories was that the diver Tom Daley had felt inferior about his sexuality, but that it had given him motivation to succeed. This was one of the top stories on the website. It was 5 years after Daley had come out. And just underneath that was news that a tsunami in Indonesia had killed at least 800 people. One day later, and the BBC's front page of the news website had as one of its lead stories that day the news that a minor reality television star in Britain called Ollie Locke had announced that he and his fiancée, Gareth Locke, were going to join their surnames to become the Locks after their forthcoming nuptials. Underneath that was the headline that the death toll in Indonesia had risen significantly overnight. The New York Times, on the 16th of October 2017, this is the international edition of the New York Times, the business section leads with a two-page story headlined "Gay in Japan and No Longer Invisible." And it relays the story of a Japanese businessman who had come out in his office in Tokyo, and nobody had any problem with it. And what's more, as the story went on to say, Japan isn't a very homophobic society. So this was man comes out in not very homophobic country and nobody cares. But that was the 2 pages of lead news story in the New York Times. If you turned to the culture section in the New York Times that day, there was a picture of 2 men dancing, and it was the news that the New York City Ballet had decided to turn one of the female roles into a male role so that 2 men were dancing together, and it had a massive news story about what an incredible breakthrough this was in the obviously previously very virulently heterosexual world of ballet. But for some reason we have fallen, and we can get into why perhaps, into this very strange fragmented view of society which fragments along these very specific lines. And I'm going to finish because I'm conscious of the clock, but I just wanted to finish by saying this. What if all of this isn't making things better? What if it isn't erasing these differences? What if it isn't saying to people you can be whatever you want to be, but it's actually making these differences accentuated? It's playing off races against each other, it's playing off the sexes against each other, it's playing off sexual minorities against majorities. What if we're not doing something that's making things better, but just doing something that's making it an awful lot worse? Thank you.
So Douglas Murray opens up with the most intellectually honest viewpoint you possibly can. He actually steelmans the case for the social justice warrior identity politics movement before pointing out a few examples of its absurdity without making any grand assertions and just asking the simple question. What if this isn't making things better, but rather making things worse? This is precisely how to start a debate. And now let's watch how our friend Silvana opens with her remarks and observe the contrast.
Less than a week ago, in the city of The Hague, thousands of progressive but mainly moderate Dutch people came together to protest Black Pete. For those of you who don't know, Black Pete is the much debated racist blackface character, part of the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas, our Dutch version of Santa Claus. These activists who were protesting Black Pete were surrounded by a large number of police to protect them against extremely violent hooligans, neo-Nazis and self-proclaimed white supremacists, such as Ben van der Kooi. 2 people are in custody at the moment relating to this incident. That's 2 out of the 60, and it means to me that 58 people were very much free to express themselves, even in the most aggressive and detrimental way possible, without any ramifications. In fact, the irony is that the mere reason my friends, party members and comrades were so brutally attacked in the first place is because of exercising their right to the freedom of speech by claiming that Black Pete is a racist caricature character. So I beg to differ that so-called political correctness or wokeness results in less free speech. I can safely say from my own personal experience that it seems to me that more can be said by some rather than as well as less by others in the current political climate, at least in the Netherlands. Words have power, and they can reinforce systems of inequality and suppression. Thus, you can still use these words. You can still be free to speak. Yet you need to be aware of what you're saying, and that if your words are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, well, somebody might just call you a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, or a transphobe. People will respond to it. So yes, you can say whatever you want to say. All you have to do is own your words and expect others to respond to what you're saying. So, as long as you own what you say, as far as I'm concerned, you can say anything. We can talk about anything. Thank you.
So, just for a little bit of context, I looked up Sylvana Simons and quickly found her posing at Marxist conferences with her Marxist friends. And it just goes to show, when you're watching a debate about free speech and there's somebody who's arguing against the person arguing for free speech, their true motives are never too far away. But nevertheless, she gives a rather extreme example of something that happened in Holland when allegedly a bunch of neo-Nazis committed violence against protesters trying to get rid of a blackface caricature. Now, I don't know much about Dutch culture or this particular event, but what I do know is that she started here with a big old gigantic logical fallacy. A big old hasty generalization by claiming that because these neo-Nazis were able to protest the protesters, then wokeness doesn't affect free speech. Solved. Now that's a reach if I've ever seen it. And then she goes on to use the anecdotal fallacy by assuring us that because of her own personal experience and what she has seen, that free speech in general is not affected because more can be said by some and less by others. Which, by the way, means that the people that she agrees with can say whatever the hell they want, and the white men can say less. And then she uses just the weakest, but unfortunately most common, and quite frankly most pathetic argument ever, which is that your words have consequences, and that if you say something ist or phobic, then you have to deal with those consequences. Conveniently though, leaving out the part where she tells you what exactly she means by ist or phobic, and also strawmanning another logical fallacy, because nobody on Douglas Murray's side thinks that they should be able to say whatever the hell they want with impunity and without a rebuttal. In fact, they welcome it. Marxist Sylvana's side doesn't want conversation, and a denial of that is a denial of reality, which, to be fair, they're actually pretty good at.
When I read your book, it came across to me that you feel a lot of the battles were almost won.
Well, I do. I use this analogy that in many of these areas, it's been my experience in my adult life that it's looked like watching a train reaching the desired destination, that is, at the station of equality. And as it draws in, suddenly getting ahead of steam, shooting off down the tracks, off the tracks, and scattering people in its wake. What I mean by that is the weaponization of things at the stage at which they've never got better, where they're presented as if they've never been worse. And I just urge people to take their foot off that pedal a little bit. That isn't to say don't keep moving, but don't lean on heuristics you've come to very recently this hard.
Sylvana, what would you respond?
Well, I always think it's necessary to really understand that even though my emancipation has reached a certain level where I can say that I now have certain privileges, it doesn't mean to say that that goes for everybody who's part of, let's say, that particular group that's identifying within a certain scope. So let's make it more concrete and say that it's fine if you're a female exec, like myself, for instance. I'm a female party leader. So it's easy for me to say that that's doable, that's possible. If I can do it, anybody can do it. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of young women who look like me do not have the same privileges and are still fighting so many battles that maybe I've overcome because of, Lord knows why, could be just my, my dominant character. But it's not to say that they have the same opportunities and the same privileges. So they still have a long way to go. And I know from experience that it's important for them to have role models and people that speak out on their behalf.
Notice there that she did whatever she could to avoid saying the words hard work and dedication, because those things in her mind are racist and patriarchal. So a little bit of mental gymnastics to get around saying those. But once again, just nothing statements. There are people who look like me who don't have the same opportunities and equality. Who? Why? What do you mean by some? Should everybody be a political party leader? Would that be equality? Like, there is no structure or meaning behind what you're saying. It's all just virtue signaling and platitudes. And when you say a lot of women who look like you, what do you mean by that? Do you mean black women in Holland or in Europe for that matter? Or do you also mean the Congo and Somalia? Or what about Papua New Guinea? And if you are talking about the latter countries, then why is it just the women that you're talking about? Because the men there aren't doing so well themselves. But this is what leftist ideologues do though. They make these broad, platitudinous statements. Statements that will make simple crowds just applaud because, oh, that sounded nice. But when you go just a little bit deeper with them into what they mean, they spontaneously combust. And now Douglas Murray is about to do what he does best and eloquently own this woman with the utmost class and sophistication.
Well, let me pass it back to Douglas then. Do you feel you can always speak as freely as you want to?
Myself, yes. I think that I'm in a, as it were, a very privileged position. I know this from audiences and readers who are in touch with me, that increasingly the things I describe which have caused career destruction for very eminent people. I mean, thinking of things like the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Tim Hunt, who made this one joke at a conference in Korea, and by the time he'd landed in London, he lost every job he had. I'm saying this has happened to very prominent people. They've either said something that's not that popular anymore or said something off colour, and so on and so forth. But my point is that all of that stuff trickles down to the workplace. And what I'm struck by now is the extent to which people who are not self-employed journalists and writers feel that they can't say the things that some people in public can say. So, for instance, let me give one very quick example. I did this on the BBC the other week, that this issue came up with this pop singer Sam Smith, who described himself as non-binary. And I got into a certain amount of trouble that didn't bother me, but because I said I don't think there's any such thing, or at least no one's explained what it is sufficiently for me to agree to it. Now, I know from feedback, including feedback in the studio from certain people at the BBC, that this is not an unpopular thing to say. I would think that if you went out to the general public and said, do you think there are people who are non-binary, and if so, can you say what they are? You'd get a fragment of 1% of people able to say that. And so my point on that is not that I've closed the argument on that, but we haven't had the argument on a whole set of things, and it seems only to be a few people who do have a voice in public who can have it.
Silvana, you're nodding your head, not in agreement.
Because I'm always surprised that certain people feel that they need to give their okay for other people to be or think something they don't necessarily understand. It doesn't matter whether I understand the beauty of physical love between two men. There's no point. You don't need my permission to feel and act. So why does Sam Smith or anybody else who considers himself non-binary needs permission from whoever? All that is up to us is to say, if this is important to you and it does not affect me in any type of way, in any type of negative way, I'm going to respect that. So if you say that you're offended by blackface every year, then I don't need to understand how come you're offended. All I need to do is say, this is not my intention. How can I fix it? And if you say you can fix it by stop acting that way, then that's what I'll do, because there is no point. People don't need your permission to be whoever they want to be.
I think it's slightly more complex than that, if I can say so.
Of course.
Let me give one reason why. Actually, the Sam Smith thing was significant. Again, sorry to go on about the BBC. The BBC's reporting of that immediately did what he asked, which was that they changed the pronouns. And some people think this isn't a big thing. Some of us do get a bit stuck on this. My point was simply that if you haven't actually had this out in public, you haven't actually discussed much of it, it's a bit strange that a major news organization would slip into saying exactly what a person had asked themselves to be described as simply because they had asked for it.
Sounds like respect to me.
It's not
nothing
the same,
more, nothing less.
It's not the same thing as respect because it's something which we haven't had out. He himself said, I don't know what it means to be non-binary. So my suggestion was he should go away and think about it. And in the meantime, we shouldn't all mutilate the language to fit around him.
Why? If I come on this stage and I say to you, I would prefer for you to call me Mr. Simons, why is it a problem to you to just give me that respect?
But well, I'm afraid that because I care about the language, I didn't particularly want to say they was very good in their performance last night. Well, I'm not going to do it simply because of
this performance is an affront to the principles of logic, and I will not put up with it. Another bad logical fallacy in that she's comparing Sam Smith wanting to be called a they-them with a black person protesting against blackface. Not the same thing. Big false equivalence. And nobody said that they need permission to go around calling themselves a they-them. Another straw man. You can call yourself a flying pink dinosaur elephant with fluffy wings and 13 toes for all I care. But don't expect me to follow suit. That's the point. If you want to live in delusion and identify as multiple people, then do so. But where people draw the line is when we are socially ostracized and we are pressured at great personal cost to utter something that we know to be a falsehood. That is below the dignity of a self-respecting human being, and we won't do it. So please, Silvana, spare us the gaslighting. And as Douglas Murray said with such class, I think it's much more complicated than that, if I may say so myself. And he's right. It is a lot more complicated than that indeed. Because Silvana's arguments are constantly the same thing. People are offended by what you're saying. Therefore, you have to stop saying it. We should be beholden to the grievances of others, and that should dictate our speech. Turning our back on basic truths and living lives of delusion is simply a matter of respect because we must not offend people at all costs. Well, Silvana, I'm actually rather offended by watching you hock up a big wad of spit and project it right in the face of truth, reason, dialogue, and other enlightenment values for that matter. Can I now expect you to calibrate your thoughts and speech with my relative levels of offense? No, obviously not.
What are you worried about will be the end result?
I'm worried that we tell little lies and we get used to little lies and then we tell bigger ones. I think it's a lie to pretend that biology doesn't matter. I think it's unwise to pass those things through always simply because of courtesy. Courtesy, I happen to agree, is one of the bedrocks of society. It's very important to be courteous, but that's not... Courtesy has a limit, and the limit is when it makes
courtesy.
people...
I used the word respect, and There's a big difference between courtesy and respect. Respect is what we absolutely need in order to live together on this planet as a diverse society, something that is hard to accept for certain people, but we are a diverse society. What we see happening is new perspectives coming in. New people saying we want to have our seat at the table because we can either represent ourselves or, as myself, have been given the mandate to represent certain groups of people. Now, those same people who for decades, if not hundreds of years, have been the dominant factor in deciding what is on the table are afraid. I do understand. I don't understand what they're afraid of. I think I do, but I'd like to hear from them. And also, I don't understand why it is of such importance to them that other people emancipate in the way they think is best.
If I may just put one thing on the end of that. On the diversity issue, I entirely agree, of course. I mean, our societies are trying to cope with a very swift increase in diversity of the kind that we've been
There's
talking about.
always been diversity.
There's
always been diversity. There's always been black people, Asian people, people of different gender, people of different sexual preferences.
There's been some.
Always have been around.
Just one at a time, though, so we can.
Of course, there's been some, but I'm saying not like this, and we are struggling with it. And I would suggest there's a useful lesson for speech in this from a very good book by the Danish journalist Flemming Rose, who wrote a book called The Tyranny of Silence a few years ago. And he made a point that I think is just worth us bearing in mind, which is, he said, in his view, that there were only two ways you could go with dealing with an increasingly diverse society. You, broadly speaking, had the choice of limiting speech or having to get people used to the fact there'd be more speech than they'd ever been used to before. And of the two, the latter, despite how painful it is far more preferable. I think the interesting thing about the whole issue of offence is not the problem with the claiming of offence is that it is not that it is obviously sometimes people. A lot of the time people say things that are offensive. It happens to most of us every day. But the problem is not that. The problem is the use of I'm offended by that as effectively a synonym for shut up. That is commonplace, and that just needs some pushing back. My suggestion, for going from what somebody said at Vox a little while ago, was why don't we try to start working out, as an interim measure, listening to each other's words and trying to hear them honestly.
But why don't we start thinking about what we say and what we do before? Why don't we start there? Why don't we take responsibility for the things we say and do before we offend people?
But my suggestion is, I say, that if we could do this, if we could practice it across lines, it would mean that we try to listen to other people in a spirit of generosity. And what we're doing at the moment is deliberately listening to people in the hope that there is something underneath the words that we can work out and we can... So my suggestion is just start with that. But I'm so glad you raised it because it's the single most unaddressed question in our society that needs addressing.
Now, if you don't grasp what I'm about to say, then you might call me a sexist. But before you do that, have a good hard think about what it is that I'm saying. In my opinion, what we've just witnessed is a prime example of the feminization of our discourse in our culture. And this perfectly correlates with the attack on masculinity that's happening concurrently. Here's the way I see it. In a household, it's the man's job to be a leader and to instill strong moral standards and character into the children. He does this by providing reasonable but tough love. And the beauty of a two-parent household and a nuclear family is that a woman can temper that tough love with affection, empathy, and more. And together, this is a beautiful unity. But when the balance tips one way or the other, it can go bad. And we know the stats that single mother households are orders of magnitude more likely to produce criminals than a two-parent household, because the aforementioned influence of a father is of critical importance. What I see happening in our current discourse is that we have gone way too far to the feminine side, where everything is about people's feelings, and we have to move mountains to make sure that people aren't offended. It's like the Freudian mother, but on a societal level, making everybody fat, spoilt, dependent, delinquent brats. We are seriously lacking logic and rationale in our current discourse. And one of the reasons is because the individuals who try and bring this to the fore get drowned out and shouted down by the feelings police. And I think that it's about time we grew some big old collective societal balls and once again began to anchor our discourse to reality. So as usual, guys, check out my other channels, link in the bio and at the top of the comments. If you guys want to watch another video, click right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.